Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I have an extra special treat for you guys. It's something I've been looking forward to for a long time now. Dr. Joseph Bergeron is on the show. Hi, Joe.
Hello, how are you, Dale?
I'm very well. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be with you.
And awesome. And kind of helping me out here, I have my Christian co-host, Daniel Lowry. Hey, Daniel.
Hey, Dale. Thanks for having me on again.
No problem. Welcome back. You always do a great job as a co-host there. So awesome. So yeah, today we're talking about, obviously, Dr. Bergeron here. He is an expert in the medical field and forensics and anatomy and that sort of thing. So I want to get his medical expertise on the crucifixion of Jesus, and even a little bit as to how that relates to the evidence from the Shroud of Turin as well. So just before we get into the actual show itself, I want to turn it straight over to my guest to introduce us as to who you are exactly, what your background is, and yeah, maybe a little bit about your faith journey, if you don't mind as well.
I became a serious Christian in the 1970s. You all weren't around then, but those were the days of the Jesus movement, when there was a pretty expansive revival in the United States and elsewhere. So I was affected by that. And actually was in ministry for a few years in my young life. And so I guess I have enough biblical background that I can look at the biblical descriptions of Jesus in the context. And then, having become a physician, now I think 25 years in practice, post-residency training. So I have a dual vantage point when I look at these things. I'm a practicing physician still. And I'm a specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation. How I fell into doing this is quite by accident. I was asked to give a lecture at Indiana University. I live in Indiana in the United States. And so I presented what physician writers had said about Jesus' execution. And then a pathologist came up to me and asked me or that I should consider writing it for submission to a publication to a medical journal, which is a daunting task, which nobody wants to do. It's a difficult thing to do. But I took that as an assignment from the Lord, and I worked on that for a couple of years and eventually got it published with some difficulty. I'm a specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation, and how this kind of falls into the way I think about things is that I've done a lot of courtroom depositions. There's only two of you interviewing me today. One of my court depositions, I had 6 attorneys interviewing me, so I can handle the both of you. But when I prepared the book, it was similar in style or a profile to how I would prepare a report for submission in a courtroom deposition. And so it's really, the book is intended to present the story to someone who really didn't know anything about it. Target audience is college students, college graduates, and people that kind of really maybe didn't know anything about Jesus or couldn't talk about it. In education and profession, I've known some really, really intelligent people that knew absolutely nothing about Jesus. And so that seemed criminal. It shouldn't be that way. So that's what the book is for. And you guys know that young people that grow up in church, 60 to 80% of them abandon their faith when they go to the university, often within the first year. And you think about that. That's an epidemic. If it was the bubonic plague or something else, you'd padlock, you'd quarantine the university, nobody'd get in. But we're thinking about the spiritual health of our young people. And so that's really what I wanted to say with the book, and to speak to give an argument for why we believe what we believe and why it makes sense, at least from a medical standpoint.
Awesome. Yeah, it's so true what you say about universities. I feel like I was a bit of a weirdo. Like, for me, it wasn't until after I graduated, then I started getting my doubts in my 20s. So I'm a bit of an oddball, but yeah, for sure, most of them in university.
Well, I respect people that study. I mean, that's important. But then ultimately we have to come to a point where we make a step of faith.
Yeah.
but we want to remove the obstacles and defend what we believe and why we believe it. And that's the intent of the writing.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, with that said, I want to get straight into the topic. So obviously the first thing to establish is, okay, well, look, how the heck do we even know that Jesus actually died by crucifixion from a historical perspective? What's some of the evidence for that?
I think the best historical evidence is stuff that's outside the Bible. And you guys, I'm sure, know about this. I have it in my book. So I thought I'd read it to you. The Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman senator. He was an orator, and he wrote a history called the Annals. He was not a Christian, had no favorable view of Christians, but he didn't have a favorable view of Nero either, it seems like, because he documented that Nero blamed Christians for the fire in Rome. And people say that Nero laughed watching the Rome burn. He was a bad player by every record of him. But Tacitus wrote, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class of hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. And you understand that any religion external to Roman religions was illegal. They would have viewed Christians as an illegal religion and weird heretics for believing in the resurrection of Jesus. Christus, or Christ, from whom the name had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty. The extreme penalty, the summa supplicum, was crucifixion. That's what he said. That's what he's writing about. During the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So this is a secular historian saying Jesus was a historical figure. His followers had what he calls the most mischievous superstition, could only mean that they're talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And thus check for a moment again broke out not only in Judea, the source of the evil, and again, they thought it was evil to have these kind of weird religious beliefs, again broke out even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, which Nero enjoyed, but as hatred against mankind. So they hated Christians. That's obvious from history, right? So mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to flames and burnt to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. That's the so-called Roman candle that Nero would light his gardens in the evening by impaling Christians and lighting their bodies on fire. So he was a bad guy.
Yeah.
But that's a secular, unfavorable description of Christians and Jesus. You can't get better history than that. And Rome was an enormous government all over the Mediterranean world. It had a developed legal system, record-keeping system. Justin Martyr wrote in his first apology, he wrote to the Emperor Antonius Pius. He was trying to get him to say, look, Christians are nice people, stop doing bad things to them. And he wanted the emperor to look up in the history of Pilate's governance to find out what he was telling was true. And he referenced a writing called the Acts of Pontius Pilate. Now that has not survived to current time, but here you have Justin Martyr was extremely courageous, in my view, to step up to the emperor and say, go look it up for yourself, emperor. These people, this really happened, and these are nice people. Stop burning them up and doing bad things to them. So those are things external to the Bible. Now, when so I was at a meeting one time and I said you could throw the Bible out the window and know that Jesus was crucified, and all the preachers in the room gasped. But but there are things you can know about Jesus without looking at the Bible at all, and that's one of them. So yeah, and then when you look at the biblical accounts of Jesus' execution, there's no reason to contest any of that. I mean, Roman crucifixion practices were well known, and there are other descriptions of crucifixion, Eusebius for one, but the crucifixion descriptions we have in the Gospels, they're accurate, and there's no reason they have historical significance on their own. Even if someone chooses not to believe in the resurrection, you can't really toss out the biblical descriptions of Jesus' execution as invalid because they're consistent with known history.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's amazing. Like, we have this double warrant, right? If you don't like the Bible, great. We've got secular historians like Tacitus that you mentioned that prove it. If you don't think the secular historians, you want to go to the biblical text, we've got equal great historical evidence that biblical scholars have used to establish that. Oh, Daniel,
Yes.
you want to say something or no? Okay, I thought you signaled there. So
I got nothing to add. I think you summed it up well, Dale.
all right, cool. All right, well, okay. So obviously, I want to kind of turn things to your expertise now as a medical expert. And okay, great. So we know historically Jesus was crucified. But how do we look at that from a medical perspective? What would have happened to Jesus, from the time he was arrested up until his crucifixion, and what would that have looked like from a medical perspective, what he went through?
Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover Seder. He probably left about, we can estimate 9 p.m. and went to the garden to pray. It's there that he asked his disciples to pray with him, which they couldn't. They fell asleep. They had a large meal, but they couldn't pray with him. But Jesus said, "My soul is in agony to the point of death." He said, I feel like I'm dying. I'm going to die right now. That's what I feel like. Jesus understood what was happening. And that's where he said, Luke tells us that he sweat drops of blood. And that's a really weird description. I never really got that for a long time until I started studying and understand that there is a observed occurrence called hematidrosis, where people do sweat blood. It's so rare that it's not well understood. There have been a couple cases that have been well studied and have various descriptions on it in terms of what biopsies look like and so forth. But we know that it occurs. Now, the type of hematidrosis that Jesus experienced is called single episode psychogenic hematidrosis. So there are some reports in literature of people that had recurrences of that sort of phenomenon. But with Jesus, it was one time. And in the Journal of Internal Medicine, there's a history of case review by authors Holoback that describe a number of cases, but the single episode psychogenic cases are just a handful, 7 or 8, and they're almost always immediately before execution. And so Luke, being a physician, probably thought that was significant. He's the only one that included that. So Jesus didn't lose a lot of blood there, but it speaks to his emotional tenor at the moment that he was really in a rough shape. Then he's arrested. Then he's taken to the home of Annas, who was the father-in-law of Joseph Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time. Now, the high priest lived in, archaeologists tell me that it was a multi-generational mansion. So Jesus is on trial there with Annas and some of the members of the Sanhedrin who pronounce him guilty. This is where he receives his first beating. This is where they throw a blanket over him, beat him up, say, "If you're the Christ, tell us who's punching you right now." So he's beaten up there. And the Jews had lost capital authority by that time. They couldn't execute somebody, but they had full liberty with corporal punishment, so they could beat him up. And you know the story that Caiaphas says to him, "Tell us plainly, are you the Christ and the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "You are going to see me sitting by God the Father and coming in clouds." And they of course are all Hebrew scholars. They knew exactly what he was talking about. It was a reference to Psalm 110, which is a messianic prophecy, which is God, or Hashem, says to the Lord God, Adonai, "Sit at my right hand." So that's kind of an oblique reference to the Trinity. But they just kind of went into rage, started tearing their clothes. He needs to be killed. This is blasphemy. And I think it's Deuteronomy, it's either 19 or 24, but blasphemy is punishable by death. So, but they can't do it. So they don't want to do it anyway, because the crowd will go nuts and blame them for killing someone who was enormously popular at the time. So they take him to the Romans. So they get to Pontius Pilate early in the morning, let's say 6 a.m. Pontius Pilate says, "Yeah, I don't know. You're from Galilee. Let's send you over to Herod Antipas." He goes to Herod Antipas. They put a purple robe on him, send him back to Pontius Pilate. When he gets to Pontius Pilate, that's where a company of soldiers, one of the Gospels says, beat him. So they stick a rod in his hand, they put a crown of thorns on his head, and they beat him up again, beating number 2. Then he's scourged. Now, scourging was with a whip with leather strips with dumbbell pieces of lead sewn into the end of them. That's called a flagrum or flagellum. And they would have been beaten all over the body. And that could be particularly severe, to the point Eusebius said that it would expose veins and arteries, internal organs, all that sort of thing. So the Roman philosopher Suetonius said people that were crucified had many reasons to die before getting to the cross. And, that's true. Now, by the time Jesus has to walk to the execution site, and he would be expected to carry the horizontal section of the cross to the execution site, he can't do it. So he's stumbling. They have to recruit Simon of Cyrene to carry that for him, because the Romans aren't going to carry it. And so that's our first indication that Jesus is probably progressing into shock at that time, because the initial symptoms of shock would be dizziness, lightheadedness, feeling sweaty, clammy, confused, that kind of stuff. And so then he gets to the execution site, and Jesus walked about 3.2 kilometers, plus or minus, depending on which crucifixion site you consider to be the valid one. And there are a couple that archaeologists consider. So that gets you to the cross. Now, then the way people were crucified, they would be nailed most of the time. If were not available, they would tie them up. But principally, it was nails. And the way the hand would be nailed would be, if you take your ring finger and bend it down as far as you can to touch the vertical wrist crease in your palm, if you drive a nail through that spot, it'll go through your wrist bones and withstand 240 pounds of extraction force. How do we know that? Dr. Barbet, who wrote a really famous book, The Doctor at Calvary, back in the 1950s, was a surgeon, and he took arms that unfortunately had to be amputated and did experiments on them. And he drove nails through them. And he found that if you put one through the middle of the palm, it would pull out with 100 pounds of extraction force. That wouldn't hold somebody up there. But going through the wrist bones, the way that I just described, it would go through the wrist bones without fracturing them and withstand 240 pounds of extraction force, which would be a stable fixation. Now, when you do that and you go through that part of the wrist, then you're either going to transect or macerate the median nerve, that's the nerve that's pinched with carpal tunnel syndrome. And what that, I don't know what it would feel like. I could just speculate and say it would feel like lightning shooting up your arm. It would be enormously painful. That's how the hands were nailed. Then the Roman crucifixion team that had already been working on him, beating him and so forth, would lift the horizontal section and place it on the vertical section of the cross, which would be stationary in the ground, and they would fasten it with a mortise and tenon coupling. So you can understand that first off, they may have done a lot of crucifixions on a particular day. During the siege of Jerusalem, Josephus said they would crucify up to 500 people in a day. So there wasn't enough wood to make crosses, according to Josephus. So it had to be expeditious. Utility had to rule the day. They weren't going to use elaborate carpentry work. They were going to use simple carpentry, a mortise and tenon coupling on a stable fixation of the vertical section of the cross, and that's called the tau cross, which is what was used in Jesus' time. And if you can get the image of that, the crucifixion victim is essentially eye to eye with his executioners when he's on the cross. The feet would then be nailed to the vertical section of the cross. And we don't know exactly how that was done, except that we have 3 crucifixion finds archaeologically. And in those, the nail was driven laterally or from the side through the heel bone or the calcaneus. That's the bone you stand on if you're walking on your heels. And then it was fixed to either the side or the front of the cross. It's hard to know exactly what they did, but the remains that we have, the nail was through the heel. And so that got you to the cross and got you on the cross. And then from there, you were just going to be there until you expired. And what's peculiar about Jesus' case is that he died in 6 hours, we can estimate by the biblical description. The synoptic gospels say that the time of death was 3 p.m. So now that was quick, because crucifixion could last for days. There are literary references of crucifixion lasting up to a week. And that's a long time. Eusebius, who was the bishop of Caesarea, wrote that he thought that people starved to death while they were crucifying. That's what he thought the cause of death was. That was my guess would be that's a consensus of what people thought in the time. So it was as prolonged a death as you could possibly manage. That was it. But Jesus died in 6 hours. Now, the other guys that were crucified that day did not die at the same time he did. So what was going on? What was happening to Jesus? There was something happening physiologically to him that wasn't obvious to observers on the scene. That points us to something physiologically occurring in his body. And I've already said that, there's the gospel descriptions suggest that Jesus was progressing into shock, more likely than not. And shock in medical language, shock means a lot of things, the sensation of electricity or being flabbergasted or whatever. But in medical language, we're talking about impaired circulation and vital organs, impaired oxygen delivery. And in the context of trauma and hemorrhage, it's from decreased circulating blood volume. Jesus had ample opportunity to bleed a lot on the way to the cross before he got there. And the chemical derangement that occurs in the context of shock is significant. It's not just a matter of blood loss. You can lose, you start to progress and you have, I think, about 5 liters of circulating blood. If you lose 10% of that, you're going to potentially start going into shock. If you lose 40% of your circulating blood volume, your blood pressure goes to 0. But there's a cascade of chemical occurrences that happened in that context, where if you deprive your organ systems of oxygen, they start dying, which creates, inflammatory mediators. It decreases the pH. It starts to become acidotic in the body, and it creates a cascade of events that, even if, let's say at hour 5, you take Jesus off the cross, you put him in an ICU, you stabilize all of his vital signs, still people are going to die anyway, because the insult is so great. The biochemical derangement that they experience is so great that even if you normalize things through intensive medical effort, they're still going to succumb anyway. Of course, in Jesus' time, they didn't have that. But I'll give you an example. Sometimes people ask me, did anyone survive crucifixion? And there's literary reference to one person surviving crucifixion, and that is that Josephus, who was an eyewitness of the siege of Jerusalem, where again, up to 500 people a day, according to Josephus, could be crucified. He saw 3 of his friends being crucified, and he was able to get a stay of execution. 3, they were taken down. One of them was nursed back to health. 2 of them died anyway, because there's a threshold beyond which the body cannot tolerate a certain level of insult before it's going to die, no matter what you do to it. So there was a physiologic process occurring in Jesus's body that caused him to die much faster than what would be expected, to the point that Pontius Pilate was surprised when Joseph of Arimathea requested Jesus' remains for burial, that he had to get the centurion to verify that Jesus had died before his remains could be released for burial. Now, I just told you a minute ago, we only have 3 archaeological finds of crucifixion victims. Does that strike you peculiar? Answer me, please.
Well, I suppose part of the question
Yes.
might be if we actually look at historical record where it talks about thousands of people being crucified and stuff like that. It seems like archaeological wise, we should be finding more remains. Am I getting that right, Dr. Bergeron?
Yeah, I think it's really peculiar. At the Spartacus rebellion in 70 BC, the Romans dispatched 30,000 troops to put down the insurrection, and they crucified 6,000 people on the Appian Way, a Roman highway from Rome, 120 kilometers from Rome down through the middle to the south of Italy. 6,000 people were crucified, and we can't find that stuff. The reason is that the remains were left on the cross to be devoured by scavenging animals. And so it would be an unusual or a rarity for the remains to be requested for burial. But anyway.
Yeah, I actually did have a quick question about that, Dr. Bergeron, because I know Craig Evans talks a little bit about this in some of his works and stuff like that, about why it's so rare to actually find crucifixion victims, why we don't see a bunch of bodies with nails sticking out of them. And one of the hypotheses that he sort of deals with is the idea that we do see crucifixion nails collected as sort of trinkets by more of the economic elite in Jerusalem. So he sort of hypothesized that the nails probably would have been taken out and then collected or sold. I'm curious, just from like a forensic lens, would a crucifixion victim, if they were buried, if they didn't have those physical signs from like the nails, would we even be able to tell them apart from a normal corpse?
You may not be able to if they were tied up, but most people were nailed. I would differ with that opinion you just, at least to my reading. The nails were harvested for reuse by the Roman execution teams, and some of the nails were harvested for use in incantation by those in the dark magic arts. I'm not sure they were worn as jewelry or amulets otherwise.
Oh, that wasn't what I was trying to imply by them. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but they were harvested and primarily for reuse. But generally speaking, you should be able to detect signs of trauma. There was the recent find in the UK in Cambridgeshire, let's say that right, where they found a nail through the heel, and there were evidence of fractured ribs and that sort of thing. The legs were not broken. And the other find is in northern Italy, where there was a nail mark through the heel. The nails had been harvested from both of those. And there were no other signs of trauma on the remains in northern Italy. The earliest find was in Jerusalem, which was thought to date to the early 1st century. That victim still had a nail in the heel, as did the one in the UK. The one in Italy, the nail had been harvested. But that victim, the Jerusalem find, did have the legs broken. I'm not sure if there were other signs of trauma. That particular find was in an ossuary. Jewish funerary customs in the Second Temple period are well known. And what they would do, they would wrap the body in a shroud. They wash the body, wrap the body in the shrouds, in a shroud. They would first anoint the body with perfumes and that sort of thing, sprinkle maybe some plants there, wrap the body. Then they would place it in the tomb in a wooden box. When the soft tissue component, when only the bones were left, then they would collect the bones and put them in an ossuary. And so the Jerusalem find was in an ossuary with other bones that were collected, and it was submersed in a syrupy kind of fluid with a lot of dense calcium over it. So it was a little bit difficult to figure out exactly what it was at first, except you could tell there was a nail through the bone. Hang on.
When you're finished with that, I have a follow-up question for you when you're ready.
I was just going to say, let's see, you can see that.
It's blurry. I can't see the title. Oh, it's because you're blurring your background, so I think it's treating it as a background thing. So
the book is Jewish Funerary Customs, Practices, and Rites in the Second Temple Period by Rachel Hatch Lilly. She's a professor at the University of Haifa. This is an academic tome. It's really expensive. It was on Amazon the other day. It was $300, but you can get the Kindle edition for $10. And what's really interesting about that book, it's just an expansive document with pictures and well researched. If somebody's really interested in that sort of thing, that is the definitive place to look. And what's really interesting, and she even mentions the Shroud of Turin. What do you think she talked about? She said, there are people, the only thing she said about the Shroud of Turin was that there are people that think the disciples put Roman coins over Jesus' eyes, or that there was some pottery fragments or something over his eyes. And she just says, didn't happen. They didn't do that. Sorry. Just remove that from your discussion.
Oh, sorry. Sorry to interrupt, but out of curiosity, because I know they've apparently found later skulls, like the 2nd and 3rd century, and they have coins in them. So is that like a later practice that didn't?
I don't know about that potentially, but her study is principally to the Second Temple period. The Second Temple was completely demolished with battering rams and with the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. You know that, and the temple was the monetary reserve for the Jewish kingdom. Billions of dollars worth of gold were taken back to Rome and used to finance the construction of the Colosseum.
Gotcha.
So I think I got off track. Did I finish your question? We were talking about
Jesus' medical condition throughout his.
Yeah.
One thing I just want to interject and just ask you here is, so you mentioned we have these 3 archaeological findings, and they still have the nails in the heel type thing. Obviously, 3 is a very small sample size relative to the thousands and stuff. Do you think, from what you know, would the Romans have had different positions to crucify? Like, could they have nailed people in different places, or would it have been standardized always through that heel type thing?
Oh, in terms of the foot, I don't know. And we don't know. I mean, it wouldn't follow correctly to try to generalize and say Jesus had nails through his heels. That's not what I'm trying to say. But those are the only finds that we have. But remember the Genesis 3:15, what's called the proto-evangelium, where God speaks to Satan and the serpent and says, the woman's offspring is going to bruise your head and you're going to bruise his heel. This is a peculiar statement, but maybe that portends to how Jesus' heel or foot was nailed. Most of the time, you know, when you look at artwork, we see some kind of block of wood on the front of the cross, and then they put the feet on that and nail that. That didn't happen. There was no block of wood to nail the feet to. They were nailed directly to the cross. So if you could figure out how to do that some other way than nailing it through the heel, I don't know. But again, it's about utility. If you have to crucify 500 people in a day, it's got to be quick and you got to move on to the next one. So it's all about utility. So I don't know. In terms of different positions, yeah, Josephus and Eusebius both document different positions that they would nail people to the cross. And you probably know that it's traditionally held that Peter was crucified upside down, preaching to his executioners until he died.
Okay, cool. All right, cool. So have you, because we kind of interrupted you a bit, do you feel you've covered everything as to what Jesus would have experienced from a medical perspective up until his death, or is there anything else you left out? Or
I think I covered it, but I want to emphasize that Jesus died rapidly, very rapidly. 6 hours, which was really quick by crucifixion, means because crucifixion was meant to last a long time, to be the most prolonged death you could possibly experience. So what killed Jesus, and when we talk about cause of death in lay terms, but really in medical language, we're talking about the mechanism of death. The mechanism of death for Jesus was traumatic hemorrhagic shock. And everything is in the name. Trauma means injury, hemorrhage means blood loss, and shock means decreased circulating blood volume in this context. And what I proposed when in my medical journal article, in the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine, that the factors were present that Jesus could have experienced what's called a trauma-induced coagulopathy, and meaning that his blood lost its ability to clot. And that's a complication that can occur in trauma. The things that portend that are tissue injury and bleeding. Well, Jesus beaten all over his body, you know, with lacerations and multiple beatings. Blood loss, tissue injury, hypothermia or decreased core body temperature. And we know that it was cold that day because Galileo had not invented the thermometer yet. So we don't know how cold it was. But we know it was cold because Peter's following along and he goes to stand by the fire with the temple guard that arrested Jesus because he's cold. The Bible says it's cold. It was cold that day. And so if he lost his bashfulness to go stand next to the guys that arrested Jesus, and then he gets confronted, and he said, well, no, we saw you there. You cut off my relative's ear. We saw you there. You're the man. You got the accent. You're one of his people. And, you know, of course, he starts denying Jesus at that point. But it was so cold, you're going to risk standing by these people that could take you out and execute you also? That's pretty cold. And we know that, you know, weather studies are done. We know that it can be cold. It can get into a freezing temperature range in the first week in April. That's not typical, but it can. And so we have to assume that it was in the colder spectrum of what occurs in the first week of April in Jerusalem. And Jesus being naked on the cross, veins and arteries constricted, sweaty, that his core body temperature could have easily decreased. And so those things create the context in which the complication can occur. And this has explanatory power in terms of a hypothesis to say it can explain why Jesus died so quickly. Also, why, blood flowed from his chest after he had died. Now, I don't think you have to have a medical degree to figure out when somebody died. Would you agree with me?
Yeah.
I've had the unfortunate part of medical life is that I've had to pronounce people dead on a few occasions. It's not rocket science. And nowadays, I think there are some statutory requirements and certifications and things to be able to do that. But, now the Roman soldiers, they came to Jesus and they found that he was dead. Do you think they're credible?
Of course, they see it all the time. Yeah.
It was their job. Now, the other thing is, they're going to release the body. They're going to take it down. Why do you think they put a spear through his chest?
Just to double check and ensure that he is dead.
Exactly. It wasn't a coup de grace. They were not trying to be nice or shorten his suffering. He was already dead. So the reason was they were going to release his remains. And if Roman military discipline was austere, it was severe. If you were on guard and you fell asleep, they were going to beat you to death. And we see in Acts chapter 16, the Philippian jailer, which was part of the Roman Empire, when he thought that Paul and Silas had escaped, he was going to fall on the sword rather than face what was coming down the road for him. If you were on a crucifixion team and you allowed a political insurgent or capital criminal to escape, it wasn't good. You were going to die yourself. They knew how to deliver a death blow. They drove the spear in there to make sure, absolutely sure, that there was not beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt that he was dead before they released the body. That's why they did that.
So that's really, so what I've learned from you, it's interesting because I've always heard, death by crucifixion, it's by asphyxiation, and that explains why they broke the legs and stuff like that. But you're saying, no, it's actually through traumatic blood loss and that sort of thing. That's what kills you through crucifixion. Did you mention the asphyxiation thing and why you don't think it works at all, or?
No, it didn't happen.
Didn't happen. Okay, cool.
It didn't happen. But I'm going to tell you why.
Okay.
You know where that idea came from? You probably do.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, it came. Let me see if you can see the book.
There's a picture of a cross on it, but the title's blurred out and stuff.
This is Dr. Pierre Barbet's book, A Doctor at Calvary, The Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ as Described by a Surgeon. This is where it came from. This became enormously popular. And Dr. Barbet proposed the idea. Well, the idea didn't originate with him. It originated really with a French surgeon named Lebec and a Czechoslovakian surgeon named Hynek, who were aware of suspension torture. And they questioned whether Jesus may have died that way. Now, in Barbet's book, in Appendix number 1, someone had reported to him that they had observed suspension torture at Dachau, at the concentration camp. And it was part of the Nazi penal code, where they could suspend someone. And in the case recorded by Dr. Barbet, that individual appeared to have difficulty breathing. The Nazis put weights on his feet, which almost caused him to die. They took the weights off, so he'd live a little bit longer, but he eventually died in 3 hours. And the description is kind of a grisly one, but it indicates that he died by asphyxiation. Suffocation is the interruption of the respiratory apparatus. Asphyxiation is the effect of oxygen deprivation. So they're two different things, but one can lead to the other. And so Dr. Barbet thought, well, that must be how Jesus died. And then he thought, well, maybe that's why they broke the legs. Well, again, now we're moving into a priori sorts of conclusions. Why did they break the leg? Well, it supports what I think. No, we don't know that. You know, of course, the immediate effect of breaking the legs would be trauma, bleeding, and with fracturing long bones, you can have fat enter the marrow, and fat enter the circulation, and cause what's called fat emboli, which can be lethal if they migrate to the heart and lungs. But we don't know. We can't assume that that's true. And then Dr. Barbet looked at the blood flow patterns on the Shroud of Turin, and he thought, oh, they bifurcate. Look, Jesus must have been changing position on the cross in order to breathe. So here again, we've moved into an a priori conclusion. The blood flow patterns support what I think. So, hey, you know, and so he presented that information. And because the book became so popular, and because I think it's easy for people to wrap their head around the idea of suffocation. Yeah, okay, I understand that, yeah. When we start talking about traumatic hemorrhagic shock, complications of shock, then we're moving into a more complex discussion. And that's a little bit harder to discuss in a lay population context. But things in physiologic systems and medical conditions don't always come to us in simple terms, and we have to deal with them in what is medically logical. So that's where the idea came from, and it became enormously popular. I did an interview one time where I started talking about this, and I said, "Oh no, he suffocated." It's like, dude, you know, you can have your own medical opinion, but go to medical school first and kind of do some study. But you can have your opinion, but you know, I'm here to talk to you about what seems logical. So, but it's become so much part of church folklore that every Easter I hear a sermon about how Jesus suffocated every time.
Well,
you know, I'm sorry, it just didn't happen that way.
Yeah.
Does it take days to suffocate? Does it take a week to suffocate? Does it? No. Now, and I quoted Eusebius earlier. Eusebius thought people starved to death when they were crucifying. He thought they died of deprivation, which is an uncomfortable death, but that's what he thought. What is conspicuously absent from ancient literature is the idea that that they were suffocating on the cross. And I would refer you to Dr. McGovern's article, which I sent you. I think is an excellent sort of deep dive on that subject.
That'll be on my blog, just for the listeners. The article he's talking about now.
I have if I can go to my slides, I can show you a picture from Dachau. Do we have time for that?
Yeah, of course.
Let me see.
Once we're done with that, I think Daniel had a follow-up question. I saw him trying to speak. So once he shows his image.
And sorry, give me a minute. Since I'm on this slide, I'll talk about it. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
The chest wound, how the chest wound would occur is it would enter on the Shroud of Turin. It's at the sixth intercostal space, the sixth space between the ribs, down on the right side. And to do that, to have the description that's described in John chapter 19, it would enter the chest cavity and first encounter liquid around the lung, which is called a pleural effusion. Pleural effusion is going to be a clear fluid and described by any kind of observer as water. Once the spear entered the right side of the heart, where it would be more likely to have a reservoir of blood that would mix with the pleural effusion, and then the appearance of the liquid emanating from the chest wound would look like blood. That is a very easily understandable explanation of why we have the dual appearance of water and blood emanating from the chest wall. And this is a picture from Dachau of the Nazi concentration torture of suspension torture. And you see this, you guys see this?
Yeah.
You see this poor individual where his arms are rotated behind him. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And so his shoulders would sublux, the shoulder blades or the scapula would be rotated, and the he would expand the chest wall. The muscles that insert from the shoulder blade onto the chest wall are called the serratus anterior muscles. Those would pull the chest wall apart or expand and cause the breathing to become difficult and even restrict diaphragmatic movement. So in Dr. Barbet's example, someone in this position or this torture could be progressed to murder, and in Dr. Barbet's example, it would occur in 3 hours. And I want to ask you, both of you, is that crucifixion?
I was going to comment that seems more in line with, say, a Jehovah's Witnesses sort of model of Jesus being crucified on a spike as opposed to a T-style cross.
Well, the Jehovah's Witness argument is that the Greek word for cross is staros, which is in classical Greek a stake. And I told you before that the Romans did that, and they burnt people up to light Nero's garden. But the Bible wasn't written in classical Greek. It was written in Koine Greek, which was the lingua franca of the Mediterranean world at the time. So their argument doesn't really carry over as valid to biblical scholars in my reading. So the people being suspended on a stake is an ancient practice. But the point here is that the vector forces of the arm on the chest and the muscles that attach the chest are extremely different. And this is as exaggerated as could possibly be, because the shoulder blades are not just as arms overhead. The shoulder blades are rotated in an extreme position with the arms behind their back and hoisted above him. So it couldn't be any worse than that in terms of the extraction, the vector force on the chest wall. This is dramatically different than crucifixion. Let me show you another slide. If I can find it. Forgive me, it took me a minute here.
No problem. And after this, I want to move on to.
Now, look at this. This is thought to be the first depiction of crucifixion, and it was found in Puteoli, Italy, and it dates to the time of the Emperor Trajan or Hadrian, which would be the late 1st, early 2nd century. It's the crucifixion of a female called Alcamilla. The name is inscribed up here, although it's not legible on this image. What you see here is you can see the depiction of scourge marks. You can see the feet. To me, I think they're trying to depict that their nail is coming laterally through the foot. Could be wrong, but that's what I think they're trying to depict. Please notice this is a tau cross. You know? So crucifixion didn't occur on a stake. I'm not saying they didn't impale people and suspend them on a stake, but that's not crucifixion.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, do you still have more to? Okay.
This is, you probably have seen this one, Graffito Blasphemo was found in Rome and circa 200 AD. And this is, the inscription says, Alexamenos adores his God. And in ancient Rome, it was typical to depict the Christian God as a human with features of a donkey. And you see that here with the head of a donkey. What I want you to notice is the shape of the cross is a T.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll stop the screen share here.
All right, perfect. All right, so I hear everything you're saying. You've kind of answered this next question a bit, but let's kind of stress it. So obviously there are some skeptics and atheists out there, and you've kind of pointed to exceptions like in Josephus, and I have a lot of Muslim listeners, Ahmadiyya Muslims. They believe in what's called the swoon theory. So I want to kind of turn it to you. Like, is it really plausible at all from a medical perspective that Jesus could have lived and swooned on the cross, and then through some combination of alloys or myrrh or something, he would have revived a few days later. Is that even possible from a medical perspective, or what's your take on that?
Well, I've done a lot of courtroom depositions. I told you that earlier. With a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that's not possible. And that would be submissible in a court of law. The reasonable degree of medical probability, more likely than not, is what's accepted in a court of law. But here we're talking about something that we talked about, Roman military discipline. We talked about crucifixion practices. To allow the person to escape death would mean death for them. Beside the fact that the descriptions of Jesus' execution suggest that he was progressing into shock before he ever got to the cross itself, and that death was rapid. And I think the centurion pronouncing death is credible. Okay, so beyond that, what about a spear going through the chest? Who's going to live through that, particularly in the ancient world? Well, they could maybe sew it together with fishing line, but that would be the best they could do.
Yeah, it's go ahead, Danny.
You're not going to get a situation where 3 days later, Jesus is going to come walking in to the upper room, and Thomas is going to go, "My Lord and my God." Or he might, if he does say that, he's not going to. It's not going to be, "Oh, he's here and he's risen." It's going to be somebody get him a blanket or something before he passes over, right?
Well, if Jesus, let's just say, okay, let's say Jesus survived and you nursed him back to health, and he moved to the south of France with Mary Magdalene, and you were going to stick around Jerusalem and tell everybody he resurrected, and then you and all your buddies start getting killed. You're going to keep perpetrating a hoax in that context? No, I mean, people will die for something they deeply believe in. But nobody dies for a lie, And so that's just, that just kind of doesn't make sense.
One thing I'd like to ask you, so I take off your medical hat and put on your theologian's hat for a second, because one thing with the Muslims, they're not restricted to only a naturalistic swoon theory. They could come up, well, maybe there was a supernatural swoon theory. Sure, and medically speaking, there's no way you could survive, but maybe it was a miracle of God. I'm just kind of interested, if someone goes for a supernatural swoon theory, how would you respond to that theological objection?
I guess I'm not sure I fully understand it, the question. I mean, so we're talking, so we'll switch into theology now, which, I'm not an academic theologian. I'm an amateur theologian. In the Old English meaning of the word amateur is someone that loves theology. And the Bible is an open source document. So when Jesus said on the cross, "It is finished," I think the word is tetelestai in Greek. And that was an accounting term in the first century. In fact, merchants would have an abbreviation for that word that they would stamp on a bill of sale when it was paid. And an ancient person, a person in the first century, reading that description of what Jesus said would have understood that Jesus said, "It's paid in full." What's paid in full? Now our redemption wasn't finished then, because our redemption wasn't finished till Jesus presented his blood before God the Father in Hebrews chapter 9. And a lot of people believe that Jesus was in hell from the time he died until his resurrection. We get that from Psalm 16, where and Peter quoted that on his first sermon in Acts chapter 2, "Thou shalt not leave my soul in hell, or have your Holy One see corruption or decay." And that's thought to be a prophetic description of the resurrection of Jesus. And when Jesus was on the cross, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, in Orthodox Christianity, we believe in the Trinity of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we at that moment when Jesus said that, the Trinity was fractured. And the theological part of that is that's where we were. Without Christ, that's where we are. Without God in this world. And Jesus experienced that. Jesus experienced hell. He experienced everything that the condemned human race would experience in the absence of receiving the forgiveness that he purchased for us with his death and again with his resurrection. So from a theological standpoint, the suffering of Jesus was in the place of you and I, of every human being, and even the people that reject him, don't believe him, curse him, don't want to talk about it, ignore it. He died for them too. And Jesus said hell was made for the devil and his angels, not for humans. I'm sure that it breaks his heart every time a human enters eternity without forgiveness from God. I'm sure that bothers him because of the extreme penalty and price that he paid to bring forgiveness and restore a relationship between God and humans. So to say that, well, Jesus really died, but then, he kind of got better and God helped him out. I think that minimizes or distorts the huge significance of what occurred, because we talk about the physical, and we've been talking about the physical suffering of Jesus, but the spiritual suffering, the greater significance of what occurred, we can talk about it. I don't think we can understand it at all. The Trinity is fractured. Jesus is in hell. That's difficult to even contemplate. But that's what brings us forgiveness. And Jesus did it for us. And so there's only we've got to do something. We've got to respond to that. The way to become right with God, to receive forgiveness of God, is not through doing an enormous amount of penance or giving to the poor or doing you name it. It's about acknowledging and responding to the work that Jesus did in his outreached hand to you. That requires two things. One is contrition, that you have to understand that you need forgiveness from God, that there's something wrong with you desperately and you need that forgiveness. The other is to acknowledge that forgiveness came through Jesus and what he did and what we've been describing, and that you pray and you receive that for yourself, and you acknowledge him, and you acknowledge that your sins are forgiven because of that, and you seek to follow him that way. So it's a simple process, but it's a profound one, and for some people very difficult to the point that they won't do it. But in a humble heart, that's how you come to God and receive what Jesus did for us. And I think that's the theological side of that you're asking.
Gotcha. Yeah, perfect answer. Thank you. I know that's not your area of expertise, but hey, as Christians, we're all theologians as well. So I want to.
The Bible's an open source document, and I would just say, don't believe me because I said it. Go and look for yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, the things we talk about are multiply attested to in the Bible itself. In the chapter 2 of my book, I talk how we know about Jesus and how the Bible descended to us, and the different things that people have tried to say about error in the Bible. But, there are armies of scholars studying the scriptures, preparing study Bibles and everything else, every controversial anything about any verse. You get a study Bible, that stuff is talked about in great detail. You can read the Gospels of Jesus and know for sure that they are penned by the authors that we believe wrote them, and that they have been handed down through time without corruption. And so anybody can pick up a Bible and understand what Jesus said and did.
Said, yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, let's put your medical hat back on now. And let's look at the other side of the equation. So great. We've talked a lot about Jesus' death. For sure, he would have died. But now let's look at some of the evidence for his resurrection after that. And obviously the best evidence for that are these resurrection appearances. And one of the areas you specialized in is, look, skeptics will come back and they'll offer various psychology-based explanations. Oh, hallucinations, illusions, mass hysteria, conversion disorder, all these types of mechanisms. So I want to turn it over to you, someone who's studied this as a medical expert. What's your take on these types of explanations? Can these appearances be explained naturally in this way?
I want to screen share again if I could.
Yep, absolutely.
Let me get back to. I don't mean to take too much time, so.
No, of course, you're the guest. So if you don't have time limits, I'm happy to keep going as long as it takes.
We talked before that Jesus was crucified. That's a historical fact, and any reasonable historian is going to acknowledge that. And that Jesus, and as we read from Tacitus, who was an unfavorable historian about Jesus, said he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and his disciples had some kind of weird belief. So that's historical fact. A serious historian is not going to contend with that. So if you're going to deal with that, and I get it that a lot of people are not going to believe in Jesus. If there's 6 billion people in the earth and only 1 billion of them are Christians, even nominally, most people don't believe in Jesus. I get it. But if you're going to step up and be academically responsible and think about it, how are you going to think about it? If you say, well, Jesus resurrected as the Bible teaches, then Christianity is true. Well, a lot of people just are not going to accept that. So what are our other options? He didn't die. Well, we have talked about how the swoon theory just really doesn't make sense at all. My favorite sentence in my book is the swoon theory is simply balderdash. If I use stronger language, I'd be censored, I guess. I don't know. It just doesn't make sense. But so if these two things are unacceptable, then we got to come over and start talking about, well, what did the disciples do that goofed it up? Well, they perpetrated a hoax. They moved the body, they said he resurrected, and then they want to start this rogue religion that would get them killed. How much sense does that make? They went to the wrong tomb. The body was snatched, and they thought Jesus resurrected. Well, does that make sense to anyone? I tell the story in my book of a young Union Army officer who was at Ford's Theater when Abraham Lincoln was shot. His name was Charles Leal. He was, within seconds, he was in the room. His first year in practice. He couldn't even wear his uniform in public because he was afraid he'd get killed. He's in the room and he finds Lincoln dead. And he starts examining him. And with his left small finger, he finds the bullet wound and pulls a clot out. Then he does CPR and he gets some vital signs back. Then he held Lincoln's hand for 10 hours till he died. And he said because he wanted Lincoln to know that when he died, because he knew he was going to die, that there was a friend present. And sometimes people rally at the moment of death. That's called terminal lucidity. People kind of rally and become lucid. And you may know in the late 19th century, there was an attempt to steal Lincoln's body.
Yeah.
It got bungled. They didn't pull it off.
Yeah.
But I just happen to wonder, do you think if Charles Leal went to Lincoln's tomb and found it empty, would he think that he resurrected?
No.
Who thinks that? Mary Magdalene went to Peter and said, they've taken away his body. I don't know where they've laid it. an empty tomb, going to the wrong tomb, any of that doesn't make anybody think anybody resurrected. That's just bizarre. So, people understand the logical problems with that. So you don't have a whole lot of options left. Well, you could propose, psychiatric phenomena. They were hallucinating. Well, if you're going to say that, if you're going to offer a medical explanation for what the disciples were experiencing, you need to provide a medical opinion and substantiation about how that would occur. Because a hallucination is a symptom, it's not really a diagnosis. You just don't say they're hallucinating and shrug and walk away and think you've done well, because you haven't. And so hallucinations occur primarily by three underlying mechanisms: psychophysiological, which could occur from perhaps certain types of strokes or tumors, or things that could cause hallucinations. Psychodynamic would be psychiatric disease and an intrusion into the conscious mind, which is people with severe mental illness can hallucinate, or psychobiochemical, where you have derangement of the brain chemistry, where people go into a state of delirium. And so you see that with alcoholic withdrawal, what's called the DTs. But I have seen people in all those in all those conditions, and it's a very ugly thing to witness. I was talking to a physician one time, and he said, we see things that humans shouldn't have to see. And that's true. I mean, I think probably most of us in the medical work carry a certain level of PTSD. I've seen things that I don't like to think about. And to see someone in a chemical delirium is really ugly. I mean, they see snakes crawling in the bed. They see elephants walking in the room. It's scary. They're not having lunch with their beloved savior. And so when I collected all that literature and read through all of it, and just understood that they had no idea what they were talking about. And I was even reading a book by one of the main proponents, a skeptic scholar named Gerd Ludemann. And I threw the book on the floor and I said, "You believe that?" I was talking to the book. Forgive me, I don't know, I had my own psychiatric moment. But I was talking to the book. I said, how can you believe that? That it's just clear that they had no idea what they were talking about. And so, were all the disciples suffering severe physical, psychiatric, or mental illness to the state that they were all hallucinating at the same time? Well, that's really not supportable. We're dealing with a group of people that Jesus hand-selected, trained, and who deployed the rapid expansion of Christianity in the first century. That I read Tacitus. By the time of AD 64, when Nero launched his first mass persecution of Christians, they were all over the place. So there was a rapid expansion of Christianity in the first century. So these people were really capable and dedicated. The other thing is that we talk about group appearances with Jesus. You mentioned, or Dan mentioned, when Jesus appears to the disciples and Thomas. So, they're all seeing Jesus. There's a dozen of them, or 11 of them, and they see Jesus. And in 1 Corinthians 15, the first creed of the church, Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. And when they recited the creed in those days, they would say, and most of them are still living. So you can go talk to them. Well, we can't say that creed today, but we can understand the historical significance of it. And we read the work from Tacitus. Those people, even people that didn't see him, it was so real to them, their faith in Christ, that they would die. They would accept being burned on the stake or crucified or whatever manner of torture, rather than to say it didn't happen. So the group the group experiences with Jesus there is no psychiatric explanation for that. So that's just outside the bounds of any kind of psychiatric phenomena. Now, there are times where groups of people can experience what you would call hallucinatory sorts of phenomena, but those kind of things are rare, and they occur in a sense where there is a group sense of excitement and expectation, and they're never identical from person to person. Well, because they couldn't be, because any kind of hallucinatory occurrence is only and exclusively in the milieu of the person's brain. Again, when we're talking about hallucination, I should give a definition. It's an experience that is considered real by the conscious mind, for which there is no external stimulus of any of the five senses. So the hallucination, is real, but there's no physical basis for it. It's in the milieu of the person's brain. So in groups of people that experience that, it's never the same from individual to individual. With the disciples, that group dynamic was not present. They were in hiding and the door was locked, and Jesus walked through the wall. They thought they were next, right? So they were forlorn, they were in hiding. They did not go to the grave on Easter Sunday morning. The women went there to complete the embalming process, but nobody else went. There was no Easter sunrise service that day. So
What? Oh, sorry. Is it okay if I just kind of ask you a question that's related to what you're saying here? So
yeah.
So granted, with group collective hallucinations, they don't happen in the sense that no one's having identical hallucinations kind of thing, but they can have similar hallucinations through like explaining to people, like, oh, I saw Jesus or something. Could some kind of social contagion like that, if somebody said, I saw Jesus or something, could that create the expectation where they would have similar enough hallucinations? Or what's your take on something like that?
I don't know. That kind of ventures into a speculative sort of discussion. I think similarity does not equate to sameness.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, cool. Yeah, so continue on. I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to get your take on something like that.
No, carry on. I'm not sure if I think I was kind of done with that, unless you had a follow-up question, Daniel.
Well, I just wanted to get on these sort of group experiences and stuff like that. One sort of discussion that I've sort of seen from authors like Tom Wright or Jake O'Connell and sorts is that it's very much framed, these sorts of experiences or psychological experiences in general are framed by the person's background knowledge. I wonder, because this is one of the core theses of Tom Wright's book, is that basically when you look at Second Temple Judaism, the disciples, even if you posit some sort of experience or psychological phenomenon, if they had any expectation, the last thing it would be that Jesus was resurrecting, even if they saw him as exalted or something, that they had the framework from which. I'm curious from like the medical perspective, when it comes to hallucinations, is that sort of like when people sort of have these experiences, is that sort of accurate? Is that what we sort of see in the literature, that people sort of, when they interpret these, they interpret them within frameworks that they already have, or do people sort of change their perspectives in that regard?
Well, I'll answer it from a historical context. The Jews didn't have any concept of a near-term resurrection. A lot of them, the Pharisees in particular, had, and a lot of the general population had a concept of resurrection at the end of time, but not a near-term resurrection. They didn't see it coming. In spite of the fact Jesus told them several times, they didn't get it. It didn't register on them. They did not believe in that. And of course, a lot of the Jewish contingency, the Sadducees, who were the major components of the Sanhedrin, did not believe in it at all. in terms of, the group phenomena, you know, people used to call it mass hysteria. I think now we call it, our more modern term would be group sociogenic illness. And I've seen that a time or two from, people that had again, hysterical is not the right word, but a conversion experience where they experienced paralysis, because I'm thinking of a young girl that was happening and at the time, and she experienced that, which was completely psychiatrically mediated. So that occurs, but it's rare and it's generally transient. In terms of people's expectations of things, again, the disciples didn't have that expectation. They were not present Easter Sunday morning. In terms of what people believe and what people think, and how that pretends to what they believe they see, again, we're entering into a speculative discussion. I can't really say. I mean, when people have sort of fictitious experiences, then it can be, different sorts of things. Whereas you have the descriptions become, beyond natural descriptions in a way that may not be possible. I'm thinking of the Gospel of Peter, which is pseudepigrapha, where allegedly when Jesus resurrected out of the tomb with two angels and his head reached up into the clouds. And so you can look at that and say, well, okay, but that's more like a Marvel comic strip than a genuine description. So I don't know. It's been a while since I read McConnell's stuff. Group phenomena is not particularly interesting to me. The times that I've seen it, again, was something I wished I had not seen. No one wants to see an adolescent youngster with paralysis that's psychiatrically mediated. That's an ugly thing to see. It's a heartbreaking thing to see. But generally people did well, and she did well. And I think I contributed to that. I won't go into the details.
Sure. Okay. So I have two quick follow-up questions on this then. So okay, so the first thing, kind of piggybacking off what Daniel was saying, one argument that I have for thinking that at the very least the group appearance of the 12 was authentic, and I argue it's because based on expectations, but specifically the Jews, even if you could get over and try to say, oh, well, maybe they were open to a unique resurrection. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that that's the case to help the skeptic. Even then it still fails, because they would have expected Jesus to come in a glorious resurrection body, but all of them saw him in a normal, mundane manner. And I think even if you allow for social contagion and they had hallucinations or whatever, I would say that at least some of them would have seen Jesus in a glorious resurrection thing, and that would have taken over. We would have had the teaching that he was in a glorious resurrection. So that kind of speaks against the hallucination. Does that make sense, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, I get your point. I mean, and I think you're correct on the underlying premise, so that they were expecting Jesus to drive the Romans out and to become the Messiah with a now term theocracy instated and drive the Romans out, and God's going to rule and reign again in Israel, and that's what they were thinking. They were looking for that description of the Messiah, which as Christians we know or believe that that's at the end of time, but they were looking at it near term, and that's what they were expecting. And as I said, they never got it. They never got the greater meaning of what was happening until much later.
Yeah.
So yeah, you would think that they would maybe have some sort of altered description, but again, I just don't think that it's a tenable position to even suggest that a hallucinatory phenomena.
Sure. All right, cool. Okay, so the last question on the hallucinations before we move on to the Shroud of Turin stuff. So I'm kind of interested, you kind of mentioned, look, the group appearances, hallucination and psychology-based mechanisms don't work. So I wanted to ask you, okay, but with any of the appearances, do you think they could work for any of them, including individual ones, or why or why not? And also, would you mind talking a little bit about the Apostle Paul specifically, because he was an interesting case in that he's a skeptic. So yeah, what's your take on those?
Well, I think you have my article.
Yeah.
And we talk about that, and Dr. Habermas went into detail about that a consensus of theological scholars concur that Paul believed that he encountered the bodily or physical Jesus on the road to Damascus. The people that have criticized or offered skeptical opinions about Paul, the most famous one, of course, is Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, thought that Paul experienced a conversion disorder. Conversion in Freudian psychoanalysis is when psychological pain is converted into physiological or neurologic symptoms. The classical description of that is the mother that finds her child drowned in the bathtub or swimming pool goes blind. They just can't deal with the psychological pain of that. And people over time kind of get past that and recover neurologic function, which again, the interruption of the neurologic function is not physiologically mediated, it's psychiatrically mediated. That occurs. And again, I've seen that in the case I mentioned previously, the young girl with paralysis. So, again, it's an ugly thing to witness, but that can occur. Now, what is peculiar or sets that apart is that the interruption of neurologic function does not accompany also a hallucination. If you say, well, Paul went blind, he had this internal turmoil, he went blind, and he saw Jesus. Well, that's not a conversion disorder, because those kinds of things don't occur simultaneously. In other words, people with conversion disorder don't also have hallucinations that would require a dual diagnosis of some kind. He had a conversion disorder and he had extreme psychiatric illness or a state of delirium or something that made him really, really sick at that moment in a way that, would probably preclude him from going on in life and being productive in any sort of way. So that's divergent from modern understanding of what conversion disorders are. The other thing is that with conversion disorder, people generally get past it and they go on with their life. And it may take some time, may take some therapy, but they generally resume their usual life activity. Now, Paul's usual life activity was persecuting Christians, watching them get stoned with mob violence, in the case of Stephen, for example, holding their coats and handing them rocks, So, but he made a 180-degree turn. He made an extreme life change and became the primary proponent of Christianity to the non-Jewish world in his time, and wrote a major proponent of the New Testament and the theological discussions of who Jesus was and the meaning of his life and death and resurrection, to the point that he eventually was beheaded for that. All those things are inconsistent with a conversion disorder. So I don't think I can understand how Carl Jung thought that was because we have the biblical description of Paul going blind for 3 days after encountering Jesus, but we can't relegate that to conversion phenomena. And it just doesn't hold weight in current understanding.
Sure. All right, perfect. So I think we can move into the part that half of my audience at least is waiting for. Your take on the Shroud of Turin.
Wait a minute.
Oh, sure.
I have a surprise for your audience.
Oh, very well. All right.
Wait for it. Wait for it.
I'm waiting.
I'm going to tell you where the Shroud of Turin was manufactured.
Oh, okay. Very interesting.
But you got to wait till the end of the show.
Okay. So,
What a teaser. What a teaser.
I know. All right. So Joe, I want to kind of ask you just in general. So, forget about from a medical or forensic perspective, just in general, the Shroud of Turin. what's kind of your take on the evidence for and against that?
That's a pretty open-ended question. What do you, what, tell me what,
Well, what's
give me a more precise question.
Okay, well, okay, so in the first place, what's your take on the historical provenance of the shroud?
I'm not an expert on the historical provenance of the shroud. That can be traced probably back to 13, whatever it was, 40, 50, where it came into the custody of the Savoy family. And then before that, it's literary references to people obtaining or possessing the burial cloth of Jesus. And then there's the Pray Codex, Pray named after a guy, not a prayer book, that dates to the late 12th century, which is a pretty accurate artistic depiction of the Shroud of Turin. So we know that it's an ancient cloth. I'm not an expert on the historical provenance, and I think that a lot to my scant reading about it, it becomes conjecture prior to the 14th century or 12th century.
Okay. So would you say you believe that it covered Jesus? It's Jesus's burial shroud, or you're agnostic? You're not sure.
That's not a scientific determination. I lectured on the Shroud of Turin in churches and national conferences, and I never say it's the burial cloth of Jesus.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
We just talk about the observations of the cloth.
Let's stick to that. Okay.
And it's an expansive sort of discussion. I'm going to let you lead and ask what you want to ask, and we can talk about it as long as you want, and I'll tell you when I don't know, like I just did.
Fair enough. And like I said, yeah, like I promise you, I'm not going to get too specific about it. I just kind of want your general take. Like, where do you stand? And yeah, so, okay, the last general question I have for you is the scientific evidence. You're aware of STIRP and their findings and stuff.
Yes.
What's kind of your general take on that? Do you think that there's evidence that suggests these images were formed miraculously, or like what's
No, they're not formed miraculously. Okay. Neither were they applied by human hand. What you see on the Shroud of Turin is two things. You see a very, very faint image of a man that is consistent with the biblical descriptions of Jesus' crucifixion, and then you see some bloodstains. The shroud itself has the physical characteristics in terms of dimensions of a burial cloth that is, again, it's well-documented Jewish funerary customs that's how they would bury people, wrap them in a shroud, and tie it with strips. In the biblical descriptions of Jesus, they had to get him off the cross and get him into the tomb quickly because Sabbath was about to start, and they couldn't be doing that by sundown, so they had to get him into a nearby tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. When we look at the shroud image, there's, I don't know how many, a bunch of pet theory. I'm going to call them pet theories. A lot of them kind of based on pseudoscience or kind of things that speculate about. None of those are terribly interesting to me. I favor the descriptions of the Shroud of Turin research project, and I think that Ray Rogers' description of the image formation is the most logically compelling.
Maillard reaction type deal.
What's that?
A Maillard reaction type thing, right?
Maillard reaction, yeah. Because, well, here's how, I'm not going to tell you where till the end, okay, but how the cloth was manufactured is consistent with linen manufacturing prior to the Middle Ages. And Pliny the Elder wrote what people call the first encyclopedia. I think it's called Natural History is what he called it. Yeah. But he was a voracious student. He read constantly. When he was too tired to read, he had other people read to him. And he told us how linen was manufactured. Now, linen was ubiquitous, and it's harvested from the flax plant. So the plant fibers, they were used everywhere. So that doesn't give us a clue about where the shroud came from. Pliny lived in Rome, and I think he lived also in Germany during the military, and then he had a government appointment in Spain. So he describes linen manufacturing in Spain, or describes the quality of linen in Spain and Italy in his natural history. But basically, they would take tufts of fibers from the flax seed. They would dye them in handfuls. Then they would weave it into cloths and stabilize it with starch, and then wash it with soapweed. And when you look at the Shroud of Turin, you can see a faint sort of plaid background on the cloth, which would be consistent with that weaving and dyeing in handful measures while producing the cloth. That's in contradistinction to medieval linen, which would be woven then dyed all at once. So you don't have that kind of underlying sort of plaid appearance. And so the the weave description, the characteristics of the weave appear to be consistent with something that's earlier than the Middle Ages. And when we talk about to cut to the quick about how that was the linen, while they were weaving it, they would stabilize the cloth, the weave with a starch. Then they would wash it with soapweed. Now, that process left a contaminant on the cloth, specifically a starch residue, which are polysaccharides, or chains of sugar molecules, glucose molecules. And then when, if a polysaccharide becomes in contact with an ammonia-based compound, then a pigment can be manufactured or produced as a side product during a Maillard reaction. Maillard reactions are common and well studied. People say that's why crust on a bread is brown. And so that the cloth, if it were wrapped around a cadaver, there would start to emit ammonia compounds, nitrogen-based compounds from the decaying body. That would react with the starch contaminant or starch residue on the cloth, and pigment could form as a side reaction by the Maillard reaction. That's the most logical basis to explain the image formation. Because the image is expressly and only on superficial fibers of the cloth. It doesn't penetrate through the cloth. It doesn't penetrate through the fiber. It's just on a very superficial aspect of superficial fibers. So, there's no paint there. There's no myrrh. There's no aloe. It was well studied by multiple mechanisms. Ancient paints and anything like that would have been easily detectable, if not by like microscopy. But the shroud was exposed to a fire in 1532. Thankfully, it wasn't burnt up. But had there been medieval paint there, that would have been easily visible. They threw water on it, would have washed the paint off. There's no paint there. The density of the fibers are there. The image of the Shroud of Turin was not applied by a human hand. It basically is a gas diffusion mechanism of nitrogen-based gases emitting from a cadaver, causing a Maillard reaction with a starch residue on the superficial fibers that left a pigment. And the pigment is not in the fiber. The pigment could be removed by diamide, a reducing agent, leaving the fiber itself unharmed, unchanged. So it's something that was not nascent to the fiber itself. It didn't penetrate through the fiber. Now, a lot of people, I've heard really smart, well-known people say things like, "Oh, it's an X-ray. Oh, it's radiation. Oh, I mean, tell me, do you know what would be an effect of radiation? Do you know? I mean, what would be an immediate effect of radiation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thermal energy.
Yeah.
Thermal energy, right? A plant fiber is cellulose. Cellulose is a repeating chain of hexose or 5-carbon chain sugars, and they're coupled in a way that they don't degrade. So that's how you get fiber in your diet. You eat cellulose, and it keeps you going. So it's pretty stable. The oldest known linen, I think, it's either 3,000 or 4,000 years, found in Egypt. If you leave linen alone, it's going to last for essentially forever. If you don't do things to it to contaminate it or destroy it. If you expose a chain of carbon-based cyclic hydrocarbons, hexose sugars, and you expose it to heat, and you extract a water molecule, let's say by a heat mechanism, or what we would call a caramelization reaction, that makes the adjacent carbon atom it's a free radical now. It's what we'd call a free radical. It's highly reactive. It's going to bind to something. And when it does that, it starts to change the configuration. So the fiber will start to change its physical appearance. And if you do that long enough, it'll burn up. But short of burning up, you're going to create scorch changes, which are very detectable, if not visibly, and they would be visibly detectable by microscopy, but by X-ray refraction, by other sorts of intricate or delicate sorts of testing mechanisms, that's easily detectable. The image on the Shroud of Turin did not form by human hand and did not form by any high energy mechanism. If you scorch the molecule, if you scorch the fiber, it scorches all the way through the fiber, not just on the surface of a few fibers. I don't know if I'm being understandable, but I want people to understand, or you to understand, that it was not applied by human hand. It's not paint, and there was no high energy mechanism that accounts for it. And the Maillard reaction, it has explanatory power in the sense that it explains how the image would form. It's consistent with known ancient weaving practices. So
just if you don't mind me,
yeah.
I just to clarify for the audience, so your position, so it's interesting because I didn't know you took this, and that's great. That's awesome. But you take Ray Rogers, I pronounce it wrong, Maillard, is that how it's supposed to be? Maillard reaction.
Maillard, yes.
And for you, is that that's it? It's a simple, that's the mechanism, or do you think it works in conjunction? Because I've seen people like Barry Schwartz, they'll say, well, that's part of the story, but you also need an additional mechanism. So I'm just wondering where you stand. Is the Maillard?
Well, I know Barry. What did he tell you was the additional mechanism?
He doesn't know.
Well, then I don't know either.
Okay.
There isn't. Why would you want to say something? Why would you want to think that? When Occam's razor, the explanation with the fewest number of special assumptions is most likely correct. When you take and you have the linen, you know how it was made, you know there's a contaminant on it because it was detected. They detected starch on the shroud. You know that amide gases are going to be emitting from a cadaver. It's if you leave it alone and if you, by anyone's measure, a Maillard reaction is going to occur in that context. So, I mean, it's going to happen.
Gotcha.
And so why not? It's really the most logical, the best explanation, again, with the fewest number of special assumptions. Now, if it was the Maillard reaction, and I say if it was, then it would suggest that the Shroud of Turin was actually a burial cloth, but it was removed from the body before liquid components of decay were present. Another interesting observation is that the Maillard reaction, I'll call it the Maillard reaction, the pigment is not present beneath the blood stains. So the blood blocked it. So the gas was not able to diffuse to the fiber. When blood was present, it stopped, it blocked the reaction from occurring. The blood is blood. It contains heme, the amino acid or protein complex that carries oxygen in our blood. That doesn't mean a whole lot, but blood's easily accessible. But
yeah. Okay. Well, let me start probing you based on your expertise then, as a medical expert, because obviously there are certain anatomical features or forensic conclusions and stuff. So obviously, we know that you believe this did indeed cover a corpse. But what is it about the images from a medical perspective that allows you, in your expertise, to say, yes, this definitely was not some artistic mechanism, it was covered by a real human corpse, and we can tell that medically or forensically or whatever?
Well, I'm not saying that. Again, we don't want to say more than what the observations can say.
Okay.
But the observations are clear that the image was not applied by a human hand. The best explanation for that is the Maillard reaction. If it is the Maillard reaction, then it would suggest that the Shroud of Turin was an actual burial shroud removed from the body before liquid components of decay occurred. You understand that's different than saying, oh yes, it's genuine, because that's a very different sort of subjective comment. So it's, I'm sorry, my right and left brain don't talk very easily to each other, but the facts I think are speak for themselves, and people can form their own opinions. But I think the facts are fairly clear, as stated. You're asking, I think, about the description of the man.
Yeah, is it anatomically accurate, for example? Or
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
The man was approximately 6 feet tall. It's hard to know for sure. The back image is longer than the front, which would be consistent with the flexion of the body. There are, depending on how you count them, about 100 scourge marks. They're consistent with the flagellum that would be used in Roman times. There are puncture marks on the scalp that would be consistent with the crown of thorns. The nasal cartilage is separated, which we would call a broken nose, but that's cartilage. It's not a bone fracture. So consistent with somebody being beat up. I think that there's swelling or a laceration on the right eyelid, if I'm correct, or swelling of the right eye cheek. The neck is flexed. The shoulders are somewhat elevated, which kind of in a shrugging type position, which would be consistent with being on a cross. There are puncture wounds in the hands. There's a puncture wound in the 6th intercostal space on the right, consistent with the descriptions of the spear wound to Jesus. There's blood emanating from the feet. Looking at the feet, just looked at them the other day. I can't exactly tell where the puncture wound is, so I don't know. I would suspect that it would be in the heels based on archaeological evidence, but I don't know that with certainty. What else can I tell you? People, the body's flexed. I've heard people get off on tangents that I think are tangents. Well, how come we don't see the neck? Because the neck was flexed.
Yeah.
Okay. How come we don't see the thumbs? Well, Dr. Zuckerby said, well, the natural history of the hand, or the natural position of the hand, I don't know if I can do it on the film, is with the thumb slightly what we would call palmar abduction, and then put it in there, which is elevated this way. But for me, I think it's a no-brainer. Again, if you take the hand and you drive a nail through this spot, some people say, oh, it makes the muscle spasm. No, if you cut the nerve, the muscle spasms for a second, then it becomes flaccid. It can't do a thing. It becomes, but if you drive a nail through that spot, the muscles that pull the thumb in are right here. You would tether the thumb like that.
Okay.
And so that's kind of a no-brainer to me. Well, why is the body flexed? Why, well, because of rigor mortis, and the shoulders were shrugged, and then the rigor would have been broken to position the arms in front of the pelvis. You sent me an article. I want to talk about that. I don't know if you're going to get to that or not.
I was, yeah. Well,
okay, I'll let you ask what you want to ask, then you can ask me about that.
Okay, cool. So just a couple follow-ups on. Okay, so great. So he is anatomically correct. I assume you would say the same about the blood flows and stuff. These are realistic and medically accurate blood flows that, given what Jesus went through, yeah, they make sense.
Well, understand that the body was washed.
Okay.
Because if he had blood splotches all over the body, we would not have any Maillard reaction. We would not have the faint image with a photonegative-like characteristic that we have. The photonegative comes from what's called the halftone effect, where the not because of variation in the density of the tone, but variation of the hue, but variation in the number of fibers per unit area. And that would be consistent with a gas diffusion process. So the body was washed. Had it not been washed, had it had blood splotches all over the body, then we wouldn't have that image. And what you have is blood emanating from the puncture sites, which can happen. People that die violent deaths can have blood ooze from wounds. And I proposed, in my medical journal article, that Jesus, I think, experienced a coagulopathy where his blood clotting mechanism was deranged.
Okay, so just to kind of clarify, so none of the blood flows as seen on the Shroud Man are from prior to his washing for you, kind of thing. You would say that they all.
That would be no, they could not be.
Okay, all right, cool. Okay, and the other last follow up on this anatomical issue is, so obviously even Stirp has admitted there are some what appear to be anatomical inaccuracies that have been discovered. So I'm kind of curious, like, are you aware of those? What do you make of those? Like, are those able to be explained in some way, or?
I'm not sure what you're referring to. Can you be? There are differences. Things like the difference between the length front and back and those kind of things may seem peculiar, but I think they're easily explainable. I'm not sure. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, or some skeptics will say, oh, the fingers are too long, or the arm, one of the arms looks like it's too long, or the face is too narrow, stuff like that.
I don't know. A friend of mine, and when I've done lectures on this with my friend, I've seen at arm's distance a digital replica from Barry of the Shroud of Turin, which is precisely accurate. I don't see anything on it that stands out as something that makes me want to say that it's not anatomically correct. A skeptic you can see and think what you want. I just don't see anything like that. And again, we're talking about a gas diffusion process for the mechanism of formation. If you want to say the fingers don't look exactly right to you, I don't know. Maybe Jesus had long fingers, maybe not. Maybe we're dealing with a diffusion process. To have some blur of that is not outside the bounds of reasonable discussion.
Awesome. All right. So my last question for you wanted to get to before I turn it over to Daniel for his follow-ups, if he has any. So you mentioned that I sent you an article. I had a guest, Arif Khan, who's a mutual friend of Barry's, and he represents the Ahmadiyya Muslims. And he said, look, no, he pointed to a medical expert on his end who apparently argued in his paper, no, the signs on the shroud suggest he was still alive. So therefore, this supports the swoon theory. The shroud man was not dead based on the evidence of the guy in the shroud. So I sent you that article, and you kind of gave your response, read through it. So yeah, what's your take? Is there any validity to these findings that maybe the shroud man wasn't dead but alive when he was wrapped in that shroud?
You know, it's a really peculiar article. I'm surprised that people put much stock in it, to be honest with you. But Dr. Acosta is a respected pathologist in his country, Spain, I think. But he starts off by saying, well, the shroud has been established as dating to the 1st century. No, it's not dated at all. It's not. We look at empiric evidence and talk about potential ages from the shroud, but it's not been formally dated correctly by anybody. I mean, I understand and I appreciate the academic efforts and integrity of people that wanting to deal with the story of Jesus and studying about it. I appreciate that. But you see, in my book, I don't talk about the Shroud of Turin. I talk about it only in the context of Dr. Barbet's argument. And Dr. Zuckerby and Dr. Barbet both devoted a lot of content to the Shroud of Turin. I did not. Why? Because it carries a lot of controversy on its own. And I didn't want to be accused of circular reasoning. And here you want to just carte blanche accept the Shroud of Turin as the burial cloth of Jesus. For sure, it dates to the 1st century. We know this is the genuine article, and then construct an argument that he was alive from that. It defies scientific integrity, and I think. But that being said, we'll just accept that and talk about it from that context. There are a number of things I think in here that are misstated. I'm not going to go through it line by line, but the gist of his argument is the time to rigor mortis. He says that Jesus was taken off the cross and and then quickly taken to a tomb, and which is true. And that the shroud was put on him in a couple hours or less, and rigor mortis would not have occurred in that quickly. And I understand what he's saying. Now for me, I'm sitting here talking to you, and I'm a relative couch potato. And if I were to fall dead in your talking to you good folks, it would probably take a couple hours for my body to start going into rigor and then progress for the subsequent 24 hours. But I knew when I was reading this that time to rigor can be highly variable. I knew that. And for you and your audience, I did some supplemental reading, just looking at forensic pathology textbooks. And let me tell you, you don't want to look at those books. The pictures in those are eye-popping, even to me, and I'm pretty desensitized to anything, but they're pretty eye-popping pictures.
I'll just say thank you.
But it supported what I already knew, is that time to rigor is really variable. So that it has to do, muscle fiber contraction is kind of like a piston mechanism, if you maybe remember from freshman biology. And rigor occurs with depletion of adenosine triphosphate and glycogen storage in the muscle fibers. And so it can take a while in a normal context, but it can be really variable. And people that die in a high metabolic state can go into rigor very quickly. An example would be like if you're in a wartime battle and you're running on a battlefield and get shot and fall dead, that person can go into rigor really quick. Or if somebody's drowning, caught underwater and drowning, and they're struggling to free themselves, ultimately succumb, they can go into rigor very quickly. And so people that die a violent death can go into rigor mortis very fast. And it's well attested to in pathological literature, the concept of cadaveric spasm, where rigor mortis occurs essentially instantly. So, and here you have Jesus, obviously in a high metabolic state. Obviously, his glycogen, his glucose storage molecules would have been depleted. He was deprived. He was beaten to death, bludgeoned, close to death, bludgeoned, walking all through the night. He's got no glycogen storage left. He dies a violent, high metabolic death. It's very reasonable, if not extremely likely, if not absolutely certain, that he would have gone into rigor mortis very rapidly. So this is the flawed premise of Dr. Acosta's argument, that Jesus just casually went into rigor mortis like the average couch potato, it was not the case. He would have gone into rigor mortis very quickly. And that's really consistent with, what we see in the Shroud of Turin. Now, Dr. Acosta says, oh, well, he's flexed and his legs are flexed. And he's kind of looks like he might be sitting up. And I'm going to call, and so he's in a reclined, they wrap him in a shroud. They can't tell he's dead. They think he's, they think he's alive, but they think he's dead. They wrap him in a burial cloth. Then they put him in the tomb in a recliner. I'm going to call that the recliner in the tomb theory. and then he has to sit up a little bit because, he's having a hard time breathing. It's non sequitur, and primarily because the underlying premise of his argument is flawed, that the time to rigor can be very fast, including cadaveric spasm. The thing that's conspicuously absent from Dr. Acosta's article is, what about the spear wound? How do you survive that?
Yeah.
I don't know. Again, I don't want to pick it apart line by line, but there's more than that. There's a lot of problems with this, but the logic of it doesn't hold weight. And for that reason, the underlying premise is flawed, and it doesn't take into account all the observations of the shroud. Most significantly, if you want to say he didn't die, explain away the stab wound.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to go through that, because like I said, there are a lot for Muslims in the UK. There are 40,000 of them that all believe in the shroud, and they do believe in this theory. So I think it was worth it to get your medical expertise on it. So
yeah, I've had a number of Muslim friends. I respect them, and I salute the folks that are interested in studying, that they even take the time to do it. And I understand that there's a lot of folks that are not going to believe in Jesus, but don't buy into a flawed argument to feel good about it. I mean, keep studying.
All right, awesome. Daniel, so yeah, I'm going to turn it to you. I'm done with my list, and yeah, I'm sure you have some follow-ups for Joe here.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bergeron. I actually wanted to get your view on the overall medical study of the shroud, and what do you think the value it might actually bring to like studies of the shroud? Because folks have been studying the medical aspects for the better part, well over a century now, from folks like Robert Buckland to you mentioned Zugby and stuff like that. I'm curious on what you make sort of their findings and their methods, what sort of value they bring to the study of the shroud in general.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm acquainted with that. I mean, again, to me, the Shroud of Turin is a peripheral issue. I've studied it in the context of studying my general research on crucifixion, and specifically with Dr. Barbet's descriptions, and then I got to know Barry Schwartz, and so I've studied in that context. And I've lectured on it, but I would not call myself a shroud expert and don't want to be viewed as a shroud spokesperson. Um, and as I said, I never say it's authentic. I just kind of present the observations and people can make their own decisions. But your specific question, if you can tell me what they are, I can comment, but I'm not directly acquainted with that work.
Yeah. Well, I guess one sort of criticism that I've sort of seen creep up a couple of times with medical examinations is that one, that you do get differing opinions on certain phenomena, and two, that most of the sort of anatomical or physical examinations are on the basis of looking at photographs as opposed to actually being there studying the cloth itself. I'm curious if that impacts, if that would make any meaningful impact into like conclusions or studies.
I don't think so. I mean, that's how we know about the shroud. Secundo Pio took his photograph, which accidentally and incidentally enhanced blue tones, and then he gets this image that is now famous. Prior to that, I think the shroud was obscure. I'm not sure how many people paid attention to it. It was a moneymaker for, I guess, some people, but when he did that photograph, and then people started to pay attention to it, and then Dale sent me the reference to Yves Delage, who presented scientific observations about it, which I'm not trying to cut you short. I'll let you finish your question, then I can talk about that.
No, that might be a good segue into it.
Because I'm sorry, I'm not acquainted with the authors that you say, and if you can describe the argument to me, maybe I can comment.
Well, so I believe it's part of the Stirp investigation that Buckland and Gil Lavoie sort of they sort of give their sort of expertise from. I believe Buckland was a medical examiner for LA County back in the day. And he basically signs off like, look, we can tell that this person is dead. We can tell that this person died in this particular way, which you've sort of described. I think you described a little bit coming from a different perspective from your own medical background and such. But they're largely making these judgments off of photographs of Barry Schwartz or some of the secondary ones. And one objection that just sort of comes up is just like, well, really, to get these precise medical these aren't ideal circumstances to get these precise diagnoses that we would like. That would be the general objection.
I think photographs are fine. I mean, again, a friend of mine possesses a digital replica of the shroud. It's precise. And I've seen that at arm's distance. It would be the same thing you would see in a photograph. And the photo negatives that Pia and others have taken, I think those are, I mean, that's what we have to work with, but I don't think it detracts from the examination and
Okay.
trying to extrapolate information from that. And then, and I've been quick to say in my writing and in my book, we can't say with precise certainty Jesus' mechanism of death or other information. We have to go based on a forensic reconstruction of what is the truth or the case more likely than not. And I think that we can do that with reasonable certainty.
I do have one thing just to jump in for a second. This is from an audience member. And they kind of asked, they pointed to crucifixions that take place in the Philippines, right? Modern day ones. So they nail through the palms, that's the wrong place. And they're tied up as well. And they say, well, there's no blood flows with that. So I know for you think the body was fully washed and therefore it's not really an issue. But I just wanted to ask you, with how Jesus would have been crucified, could blood have flowed from the nails down the arms on that, or would the nail have plugged the wound so that no blood would flow or something?
Blood could flow from the wound, but it would not be a copious amount of blood. Let me see if I think I have a slide on that. And you can see, and the artist here has the nail actually is down lower than what it should be to compare with where it's located here. It should be more up in here. But the point here is that the primary circulation of the hand is undisturbed by the placement of the nail. So there would not have been a large amount of blood shed from the nail piercing, as opposed to somebody that maybe wants to cut their wrist and they think they're going to be successful that way. It's not. But the arterial circulation would be this way, but it would be undisturbed by the placement of the nail. But again, the shroud images, if we accept that for the sake of argument, that's blood flow from puncture wounds after the body has been washed.
And when you say, so if the blood flows, like once you remove the nail, then is that when more blood would flow, or would it still be the same?
I mean, one of the arguments people make is that, well, if he's dead, then why is blood flowing from it? But again, it's because it can occur, the coagulopathy and the state of the blood coagulation immediate after death. It may not be coagulated, and that's what we see here. If you look at the images of the shroud, that's not a lot of blood. I mean, go take 4 to 6 ounces of tomato juice and pour it out on a napkin and see what it looks like. It'd be pretty big stain. What you see is, a small amount of blood from trickling on the arm, in the shroud image, and a very small amount trickling from the scalp. The only place you see a copious amount of discharge is from the chest wound. And as I described earlier, the chest wound is blood mixed with fluid around the chest, or pleural fluid, and so that would have more of a large amount of fluid emanating from that.
All right, cool. Daniel, did you have anything else?
No, I think that wraps it up for most of my questions.
Sorry if I'm not answering you.
No. I really appreciate getting your perspective on it, and it's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, awesome. Well, yeah, if Daniel doesn't have any other follow-ups left, then I think we can kind of close out. One thing I'll say, Joe, is there anything else that neither of us have asked you about that you feel is really important, given your expertise and your research, that you think the audience should know about?
No, I think we've covered it pretty comprehensively. I'll answer things that you sent me emails to read. One is the Yves Delage. Again, I don't read everybody's pet theory, but I read about him since you sent me that thing, and I thought, wow, that I really like him. He was not a religious guy, but he said, Jesus was a real person. Why would we think it's strange something couldn't be passed down from his time? And he was open-minded about it, and he was really on the right track, because he ultimately postulated a gas diffusion mechanism of image formation. And he thought it was contact with Marinello, which was, of course, not present on the shroud, but he was kind of thinking in the right direction. And I think I don't think it is a major contribution to, well, maybe it is. It's a contribution to shroud study, but the major thing is that after Secunda Pia, he brought the Shroud of Turin into scientific discussion, and that's the historical significance of what he did. And then you sent me something about somebody did blood flow pattern studies, and they took some blood, and it's interesting because I knew about that one because I saw it on the religion page of Fox News.
Yeah.
And then I read the article, and I wrote to the author, and I said, first off, you know what they did? They took blood harvested for transfusion, which, of course, that's treated so it doesn't coagulate. So we don't really know that the viscosity is exactly what it would be like in a cadaver, normally speaking, or Jesus. So we don't really know. Now, what do you think causes blood fluid to flow in a certain direction? Do you know?
Imagine gravity?
No, it's not gravity. Wrong.
Pressure. I don't know.
I'm going to tell you. No, it's not. It's kind of it's freshman chemistry. It's capillary action.
Okay.
So it's the relative affinity, the electrical kind of orientation of the molecule in the liquid, and its affinity for what's next to it. And so the guys that are doing those blood flow things, they said, "Oh, look, you know, it falls off the arm. It can't possibly be, you know." And so the problem is the blood flow is a small amount of blood, I think very small, and it flows on the cloth by capillary action. It's not gravity, it's capillary action. Capillary action is, say you take a glass of water, excuse me, and you take a napkin and you put the end of the napkin in the glass of water. And what happens? The water starts to climb up the napkin, correct?
Yeah.
That's capillary action. You have a trace amount of blood flowing down your arm and you put a cloth on it. What makes the blood flow where it's going to flow? It's the capillary action, the interaction between the molecules in the blood versus the cloth and their affinity for each other. And so that blood flow article, I just couldn't really think it made much sense. I wrote to the author of the article. He did not respond.
Of course, he's well known, and he's a Shroud skeptic.
Oh, is he? I don't know who he is. I just saw it and I thought, wait, no.
just for the, we're talking about Luigi Garlascelli's 2018 blood pattern analysis
Yeah.
study.
So I mean, yeah, I don't if it weren't about such a sensational topic, I can't imagine how it would be published.
Yeah, for sure. It's really bad. I think it's pretty obvious.
And that's the way a lot of Shroud literature is. That's
Yeah.
why I even talk about it at all. You know, now I have lectured on the Shroud to audiences, and it's particularly in Catholic churches, and the amount of reverence that they have for the Shroud and how they venerate it. It's very humbling. I am very careful to be very respectful in my discussion of it. You know, and it's not so much among Protestant Christians, but you know, you have to respect the way people think about it, and I do. And so I would stop short of saying, "Oh yes, I know for sure it's authentic." That's not a statement I would make, or I don't think that's not a scientific statement, but that someone could come to that subjective conclusion is something that I think is logically mediated and not something that I would fault.
Well, that you thought you were going to get away with it. No, I just remembered you made a promise at the beginning of the
Yeah.
Shroud section.
You waited for it. you waited for it.
Very
so here it comes. The Shroud of Turin was not manufactured in Jerusalem, at least based on textile archaeological finds of the period. And the reason we know that is that the herringbone pattern of weave is not something that the Jews did. So where did it come from? First off, you know, I should backstep and say, what about, you know, I never really talked about the age of the Shroud, and it has not been formally aged. The age has not been scientifically stated. I think probably your listeners know that the carbon dating test in 1988 was flawed due to a sampling error. They cut a swatch of cloth the size of your small finger and cut it into 3 slips and sent it off to the lab. Now, the lab's not in question, but it's a sampling problem where there were cotton fibers mixed with linen fibers, and in Jewish law, you didn't mix fibers when you were weaving cloth. I want to say that's Leviticus 19, if I got that right. And so that they would carry that over into shroud production. So to find cotton mixed with linen, it would be inconsistent with Jewish customs. So it would really represent a repair because the shroud had been extensively handled through time. And if you look at linen under a microscope and cotton under a microscope, they look drastically different. Linen fibers look kind of like bamboo with kind of, growth nodes progressing through the fiber, whereas a cotton fiber looks like a spiral piece of tape. So it's unmistakable. So that's a sampling error. So we have to, I think, serious students of the shroud understand that that's flawed. So what can we say about the data of the shroud? Well, there was a recent study of X-ray refraction of the shroud fibers that found it to be consistent with, and we're talking about X-ray refraction, and that it was consistent with fibers found from Masada, which was decimated in AD 74, but not like linen fibers from more recent times. And my friend Barry Schwartz will be quick to say, well, that's not a dating mechanism. We don't date things that way. Nobody believes that. Nobody accepts that. I get that. I understand that. But I don't think, well, maybe the authors wanted to say that, but I wouldn't say that. But it is a piece of physical evidence that has some relevance in an academic context. And then the way Ray Rogers did the dating was by looking at the concentration of lignin at the growth nodes in the cellulose, or the shroud, the flax fibers in the shroud. Now, lignin is at the growth nodes. And what is present in the lignin is something you've all eaten, vanillin, because it's a component of vanilla. It's a component of artificial vanilla flavor. In fact, I read somewhere that 40% of commercial grade vanillin is harvested from flax fibers. So we all eat that. But over time, very, very slowly, the vanillin will evolve from the lignin in the growth nodes and decrease in concentration. And when you do the test for that on the Shroud of Turin, it's not detectable. So that's a chemical reaction that takes a really, really long time to occur, because it was detectable on the Holland cloth that was sewn to the shroud in 1534. So Ray Rogers, being the brilliant chemist and mathematician that he was able to understand it, because in chemistry, people will understand that the rate of a chemical reaction can be known. And so it can be calculated when the vanillin would be evolved from the growth nodes of the fibers and undetectable. It can be calculated. The problem is we don't know all the variables. We don't know the temperature history of the shroud through history. So that leaves us squarely in a range of time. And I think if I remember Rogers, I think he stated that the Shroud of Turin, again, the chemical characteristics of the shroud, specifically the absence of detectable vanillin at the lignin growth nodes of the fibers, are consistent with dating of the shroud between 1200 and 3000 years old. It's consistent with, linen found in ancient Egypt that's thousands of years old. But it's not consistent with more recently manufactured linen. So, we have empiric evidence to suggest that the shroud could maybe date to the time of Christ. At a minimum, it's really old. It's not medieval. It's older than that. Okay, so let's go back to the 1st century. The Jews did not make herringbone weave. They didn't. Now, weaving was something that was every household did weaving, even aristocratic households, because it was extremely labor intensive. It was done by hand. It would take several people a month to weave a Roman toga. So to buy a ready-made cloth the size of the Shroud of Turin would be outlandishly expensive. And Barry Schwartz says he believes that Joseph of Arimathea had it in his possession already. And And I did some looking at that, and there are some renderings of some. I'm not a student of ancient language, but some of the translations can be rendered that way, that it was a cloth that he had, rather than when we read the Gospels, a lot of it's translated, he went out and bought a cloth. Well, there was no Walmart there. I mean, and it would be really tough to get a ready-made cloth, particularly from something like what he possessed, which would be a really expensive cloth. To get that, I'm sure somebody sold them somewhere, but it would be expensive. But Barry thinks he already had it in his possession. I think that's at least part of the discussion, that could reasonably be the case based on some renderings of the translation. So the herringbone pattern, who used the herringbone pattern for anything? The Romans. That's how they set the bricks in their highways. They somehow understood that it was more resilient, or it held up under tension. The floor of the market of the Trajan's market, is that what it's called? It dates to the 1st century. The floor of that mall, I'm going to call it a shopping mall.
Trajan's Forum, I think, is, yeah.
What's that?
Trajan's Forum.
Yeah, it was a shopping mall, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, the brick patterns were in herringbone. And I did come across a reference of a piece of linen that was found in a tomb in the UK in the 1st century that had a herringbone pattern. So herringbone weave did exist in that time. But it didn't exist in Jerusalem. Now, the Jewish expatriate population in Rome was big. Some say up to 10% of the population. And they're specifically mentioned in Acts chapter 2, for example, Jews from all over the world, and then they start naming places, and Rome. They specifically name Rome. So, it seems the best explanation, I think, of course, we can't know for sure. I've searched for and can't find a period cloth exactly like the shroud, but the herringbone pattern is really strange. It's not Jewish. And it's the largest, I think, expatriate population that time would be in Rome. And I think it was a Roman import. And I think it was part of Joseph's end of life planning that he had this really expensive imported cloth along with his newly cut tomb. And, that's one of the prophecy, it's Isaiah 59, I'm not sure, but where he's buried among the wealthy.
Oh, 53.
And I think that could be consistent with that messianic prophecy. So I think the Shroud of Turin came from Rome. I can't give you an address, but that's where I think it came from.
Interesting. All right. Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for revealing that at the end for me and the audience. I think that's interesting as well. And I'm wondering how it will relate to other studies. Like, I know I had Giulio Fonti on the show, and he was talking about, well, there's DNA studies that show it came from India or was manufactured in India or something. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's just interesting to see.
I have not, but I oh, you mean that the linen fibers itself, DNA can be placed in India?
Yeah. Is that what
I would have concern. Well, I don't know, because I'm not a textile person, and it's not something I've studied more than just what I've just told you. But linen was used everywhere. Okay. The fact that linen comprises the fibers of the cloth means nothing by itself. And it's so old and been handled so much, can the DNA be considered reliable? I just don't know the answer to that.
Go ahead, Daniel. I saw that.
I was going to say, I think if you're referencing the study that I'm thinking of, it was looking at human DNA that was found in the shroud, and it found the largest concentrations in
that was
northern sort of Syria, Palestine area, Western Europe. And then there was this third large cluster that was centered around the Indian subcontinent. And one of the hypotheses that one of the authors sort of flirted with. He didn't say this was the case, but he sort of said that perhaps the cloth was originally manufactured in India, because that way we could sort of get that to work with our known history and our proposed history of the shroud being in Jerusalem and then working its way to Europe. Otherwise, it's just this weird sort of anomaly.
I don't know. That's a peculiar. I have not heard of that. I can just make some general comments. The shroud has been handled by so many people all over the place all the time that it wouldn't be inconceivable that somebody from India was handling it somewhere. Yeah, I don't know, what do we really make of that? And just in terms of, medical anthropology, when we start looking at races and how we define races, though that's kind of based on anthropomorphic features, whereas, my wife is from India. So, Northern Indians are Aryans. Did you know that? Southern Indians are Dravidians. They're different races. So if the Aryan race extends across the Mediterranean, could you reasonably differentiate a Northern Indian's DNA from someone from the south of France? I just don't know the answer to that. Maybe you could, but in terms of racial identification, they would look similar. I don't know, but I mean, the bigger problem is it's just too old. It's just been handled by too many people to try to use DNA that you find on it to say anything is problematic.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, I think that says it all. I think we can wrap up now. So I just want to say thank you guys so much. Thank you, Dr. Joe Bergeron, for being on. You were a great guest. I loved the information that you gave, very detailed, very helpful. And that's not all for the audience. He's provided me with various papers and links and stuff. So if you ever want to do further research, please click on those. I hope you had a good time on your end there, Joe.
Yeah, it was a pleasure I like talking to smart young people. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You're welcome. That's why I brought Daniel, because I didn't want you to dumb me. But,
you look young.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm probably older than both of you put together. So
there you go. And thank you, Daniel, as well, for always being willing to help me out as a co-host. You did a great job. So
yeah, thanks for having me on again. It was great just to hear such amazing scholarship from Dr. Bergeron. So
awesome. All right. Cool. So yeah, with that said, just so the audience knows what I have coming up next week. So not one, but two shows. And again, they're specifically focused on the Shroud of Turin. This is my Shroud month, I guess, for shows. So I have Bob Rucker and Hugh Ferry coming on to do my Shroud solo show panel review from episodes 1 and 2. And then so that's going to be recorded on the 27th, Thursday. I'll probably have it up for you guys on Friday or something. And then on Saturday, Daniel's going to be joining me again as a co-host because we're bringing on board Barry Schwartz, who's going to be doing his master's presentation on the various image forming mechanisms, or specifically the artistic ones, why they don't work, why they fail. So yeah, you got two shows to look forward to on the Shroud of Turin next week. So with that said,
Barry knows everything, so you can talk to him about that in detail.
He's the omniscient Shroud scholar, isn't he? So
yeah, please give him my regards.
I will, for sure. All right, cool. Well, have a great week, and I will click the button.